Downside.
So let's get 1. Well, at 1.01, the amp runs out. Done.
Right.
It can't handle anything instantaneous peak load need beyond that. We've talked about amplifiers for headphones in a number of our videos, all about the various reasons why, you need an amplifier. Some people are using speaker amplifiers for headphones, which is a whole nother topic altogether. It's kind of dangerous and all that stuff. But, if you don't know if man's got to know his limitations. Right? But anyway, you notice though, it seems like in the higher end of things, the better headphones tend to prefer more power. And I don't think we ever actually just kind of explained that, or if people understand
we sort of skimmed
why.
it, but not really.
Yeah.
It does seem to be a trend. Overwhelmingly, high-end headphones tend to either require or prefer a lot more power than you normally get out of your phone, your laptop, your dongle, or whatever. More power than a traditional thing will put out. And it seems there's a few reasons for that. But I think overwhelmingly, it's sort of because they can. There's trivial benefits often that you could get away with if you have more drive power. There's sort of more leverage afforded to you. There's things you could do in different ways you can make the driver that may benefit slightly from having more power available. So if you're in the high end anyways, a lot of times there isn't really much of a penalty. Just say, hey, it needs more power than your phone. And on top of that, a lot of times things like laptops or whatever don't really sound the greatest either way. So it kind of sort of kills two birds there, I guess you would say, because it forces people to require some sort of higher end setup than like just plugging it into a laptop or something.
I mean, it's like a known use case, When you're selling like a mass market $30 headphone, you can't expect everybody to know that they need, watts of power, right? You're going to be plugging into a phone or an MP3 player or whatever,
Yeah, they got to make the speaker drivers in those highly efficient and highly compatible with just about any jack that can plug into. So
I guess
it's a different market.
It's a top design criteria.
Yeah.
Whereas in the high end, it doesn't really matter as much.
But the toss of the coin there is that, one thing people need to understand is that power relates to, or the available power relates to acoustic pressure. Like how much air can this thing move? And I mean, it's kind of like any machine, right? I mean, you're converting electrical signal to mechanical motion. The difference between a 5 horsepower go-kart engine and a 150 horsepower 4-cylinder in a car is dramatic in terms of how much work it can do. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with when you're talking about converting to acoustic pressure or energy. The more power you have in reserve or available, the more potential air this driver can push up to its limits, obviously. And I think that's one of the things that does vary on the higher end of things is the manufacturers of the headphones design it around having power. So the drivers can handle the power. Where if you took like that $30 headphone and plugged in a big amp, you'd smoke it. If you turned the volume up high enough, you'd probably smoke it pretty quick, because those things are made for 50 milliwatts. And here we're running 3, 4, 5, 6 watts, which is, 50 times the power. So
it's like we say all the time, you could design a thing, if you're making it, to do pretty much whatever you want it to do. And all it really means is in the high end, you don't have to worry about power being a limiting factor. When you're making a low-cost headphone, it has to be efficient. You have no choice, because people are going to plug it into laptops and phones and things like that don't have particularly high power out. And it tends to be preferred from a consumer perspective to have high efficiency as you can get away with, because it means marginally better runtime and things like that. But in the high end, these things aren't really factors. If you could get better sound, that tends to be the preference, even if it's only a really trivial improvement.
That's the thing with like a lower power device like that. You won't get the dynamics of the music. It's not possible. It can't move, stop, and start so instantaneously because it has no reserve. There's nothing backing it. Like a big amp has a big power supply, more output devices, lower output impedance. All these things help to control the driver, reproduce music.
Well, it comes back to that we said before. It's like you can't reproduce like a rock concert with 50 milliwatts, right?
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah,
It'll never.
Yeah, it's like you just hear a whisper in the corner somewhere. It wouldn't make it 3 feet.
Well, it truly is a physical thing. There's really no getting around it. Even if you had a hyper-efficient driver, which some people would consider to be preferred, you are working against the reality of the human hearing. And you probably could come up with a theoretical estimation of the power required in an ideal situation to move the air to generate this certain sound level and whatnot. But in practice, that tends to be a highly optimistic figure that's sort of unrealistic to achieve. And on top of that, you have other design considerations that tend to be more pertinent in high end. So really just ignoring the power altogether tends to be the preferred thing for high end because it's easier. It makes it so you could focus more on just the sonic fidelity, the performance of the thing, and you can make it achieve whatever you want as long as you're not only worried first and foremost about making it be hyper efficient because it really isn't that important.
It's that whole trade-off thing, when you're designing anything. You're trading off power requirements for efficiency or something like that. I mean, it's everything's a trade-off, and in the end, you don't have to worry. Like you said, you don't have to worry about the power being part of the trade-off. It's no longer variable. It's basically what you consider it to be unlimited as to what's available to you. And if it's not available, somebody will make an amp that'll run it sooner or later.
Well, it's the difference between asking what do you need and what can you get away with, I guess, to some extent, because there's certain times where you have physical limitations where you can't use more than this amount of power or whatever. And then you have to work around that. But it is a limitation more often than not. You know you can't use more than this, so you have to, as one of your design criteria, this needs to be involved. And it can sometimes interfere with the sound, the performance, the cost, the design, the style. Like there could be a huge number of aspects that are influenced by things like this. So simply eliminating something like that as a limitation tends to be better. It tends to make it so your device could achieve better performance elsewhere. And
you remember when we first came out with the 1266?
Yeah.
What could drive it?
Nothing.
Not many things.
One, I can think of one.
Ray Samuels, right?
No, Cavelli. Remember at the same time we were working with Alex Cavelli?
Yeah. Oh, that was
and
the Liquid Fire.
He was just finishing the Liquid. The Liquid Fire wasn't bad, but it was pretty good. It drove it, but the Liquid Gold he was just finishing.
Right.
Remember, that was a solid state, like I think 6 watts. I forgot what it was rated for. There was no solid state amp out there that I'm aware of that was that
The Liquid
powerful.
Gold is best, yeah.
And it was the only amp that at the time, we're talking 2013 or so, that was the only amp that could actually show what the driver was capable of in terms of impact, speed, bottom end performance, And but it's funny, but how far we've come now. That was damn near 10 years ago.
It's sort of a chicken and egg situation, though, because people weren't making high-end, high-power amplifiers because the perception was nothing needed it. And, of course, that makes sense. Why would you make a product that doesn't need to exist? Generally, I think probably the reasonable approach is to make a headphone that achieves the best it can, even if it is hard to drive. That seems to be a slightly more sensible approach, because making an amplifier for a headphone that doesn't exist, it doesn't really create much of a need for that headphone to exist in the future. But if you make a headphone that's hard to drive, it does sort of make it more likely that people are going to make amplifiers to drive it.
I wasn't too worried about it because I've seen the same scenario play out in the speaker world, where you had certain manufacturers that would do like 2 ohm, 3 ohm, speakers, or speakers that would dip below 4 at certain ranges.
Yeah.
And, you'd have amps just blowing fuses. And like you hit a 2 ohm or so with most solid state high end amps, and it's going to cause an issue with it, instability, whatever, So there had to be amps made, that could handle like a 1 ohm load.
Right.
Basically like a pro amp or something like that, but smoother sounding.
Well, there was one example, the K1000 that was demanding. And I remember Woo back then, they had a setting just for
On the tube amp.
Yeah, for the tube amp, just for the K1000.
Yeah, it must have had a tap on the transformer, an
Yeah.
output transformer that changed
So
the
that
output
was
impedance.
an amp that came along.
I don't know what the impedance of that
specifically.
headphone was, do you?
No.
It must have been low, you know?
Presumably.
Probably like a dead short.
For the
that's-
day at least.
But that's the thing. I mean, you know, when you have an amplifier that has a decent power supply and low output impedance, it doesn't have a problem driving through the various loads, which is another reason a bigger amp is better, because some headphones are 10, 16 ohms and others are 100, 300. So, you know, when you get to the higher impedance headphones, they're looking for some voltage. You're looking for some gain from the system to be able to drive them properly, and which a big amp will have. And then on the lower end of things, right, to drive like 16 ohms or 10 ohms or whatever the lower impedance ones, they're looking for more current. And again, a bigger amp will have a bigger power supply and lower output impedance, be capable to drive that current into the load. So you could say a bigger amp is more universal, even though it's a bit scary with some of the higher
Can
efficiency
be.
stuff, because you got to watch, you got to understand the limits of the volume control. And, you know, a lot of the amps have gain settings too. So usually if you're getting a headphone amp, a bigger headphone amp, most of them have high and low gain. And so on the higher, so you still get the, you know, the, what do you call it, the benefit of having low output impedance, big power supply.
right.
It just doesn't, the volume has more range. You don't have to worry about turning it up too high.
It's sort of like anything. Having more power and not needing it usually is better than not having the power and needing it. Sometimes there are some design compromises that are made to make a high power amplifier, but intrinsically that isn't really the case. So it tends to be the preferred approach to design the headphone as best you can, ignoring the power requirements. And sometimes it just so happens that the way you wanted the design, you want it to be, say, more tolerant of leakage or poor seals or something like that. And as a result, you need dramatically more energy and acoustic pressure. But there's a multitude of reasons why. Maybe you're a planar magnetic and you benefit from the electrical damping factor of having a low output impedance amplifier. And then in that case, you want high power amp typically. And there tends to be a few different design considerations that benefit from having higher power amplifiers. And the thing that people seem to get confused on, it's really not about the power. You always see people do the calculations and say, oh, at this volume level with this efficiency,
Yeah,
you
don't need this much
52
voltage or
milliwatts,
watts.
which is true.
Yeah.
It's sort of misleading because there tends to be other factors at play. Although those numbers are true, you really don't need a lot of power. That doesn't mean you need a low power amplifier, because usually it's very hard and sort of not really feasible for most manufacturers.
Well, and you just set yourself up for a ceiling. I mean, now that's the ceiling for the system. If you say, well, you only need 1 watt, but you could have 2 or 3. Why not, right? But you only need 1.
Well, what's the downside?
So let's get
Yeah.
1. Well, at 1.01, the amp runs out. Done.
Right.
It can't handle anything instantaneous peak load need beyond that. So now, say you want to play with EQ and you're bumping up the 30 hertz range a few dB, you're clipping your amp because it's now demanding 1.2 watts on peaks.
Yeah, what is very uncommon
You know?
to actually need more than 1 watt. So it's sort of a difficult thing to get across. But I think the easiest way to put it is, if you're building the best of the best, if you're putting together a system that you want to be as good as it could be, it tends to be better just to give it more than you need, and then you have enough. That's no longer the limiting factor.
Overhead, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, it's an effortless sound. I mean, that's what you get typically. Like at home, I run on my speaker system. I got 500 watt solid state monos, right? I've had them for years, and I love big mono amps. I love the sound of that with speakers versus a stereo amp like a 100 watter.
Yeah.
Because and again, you could do the same calculations on an 8 ohm speaker, 90 some dB efficient. You don't need 100 watts. You can get away with 5 or 10 more comfortably. But,
Right.
It depends. Depends what you're listening to. Depends if you're indulging yourself with certain things like, something like an AC/DC track or something
Well,
with some serious bottom.
Depends on
end
the
to it.
speakers too, because some speakers have like wild swings at certain frequencies,
Yeah.
and
But just to have it on tap, right? The sound's more effortless. Like with a 100 watt amp, guaranteed, you will hear it run out. It will sound like the system just craps out at a certain level, and it makes dynamics and stuff compressed almost sounding. And the same with headphones.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it just, you go from, wow, something, when it hits hard, it's not as visceral as it could be. Now you go from like a 1 watt headphone amp to a 5 watt headphone amp. You
Yeah,
know, a real
doesn't
5
happen
watts.
anymore.
Yeah, all of a sudden, wow, that bass impact is crazy good. And it's just a change in an amp. Same speakers, same
Well, I know
everything.
I run into that. I said this before, like with my receiver. You know, it's trying to drive 7 channels or whatever. You know, at 100 watts a channel, right? But yeah, you get like that last like 10, you know,
Yeah.
in the range, and it's just like it's not getting any louder,
just runs out.
and then it just shuts off.
Well, the power supply just ran out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing when you buy like couple $100 receivers
Yeah.
versus a couple thousand. One of the things you're paying for in the more expensive designs is a much larger power supply, beefier output transistor stages that can drive more current into a load. Everything just gets bigger when you pay more. And, you know, and it's, again, for a lot of systems with people who are driving the shit out of them, it's quite noticeable. Noticeable.
Here's what everybody should do: get some Macintosh monoblocks and then watch the meters.
Yeah.
It's like that explains it right there. You know, you're like, most of the time you're like, well, we're using like 2 watts.
Yeah, it's
But
funny
it
how
goes up to 300,
those
right?
big watt meters that they
Yeah.
show wattage. Yeah, when you're playing it, like
You need like 2.
they don't move a lot,
No.
and all of a sudden something
Yeah.
will happen, and whoa,
Yeah.
and it's like whoa, and it's so quick that the meter can't even keep up with it because it's a freaking analog meter, right? You can't watch it, but it shows you that all of
Yeah.
a sudden something occurred, and bam, and all of a sudden it's calling for who knows how much because the meter can't keep up with the peak.
There's a lot of complexities involved, and I think it's sort of a difficult thing to really describe easily. But generally, there's overwhelmingly technical benefits from having the power and not needing it, and very little, if any, downside. Generally speaking, amplifiers perform best when they're not run at heavy load. So if you could get more power and not use most of it, that usually works best. And since audiophiles tend to be looking for the best of the best, that's sort of the best approach, usually. Have more than you need.
And, you know, and again, sound-wise. Now, one thing to consider, though, there are trade-offs between how much power you have and what the amp actually sounds like. You know, you don't want to go for a 50-watt amp, you know, or a speaker amp or something. And
Well, there's no point there.
It doesn't sound right. It just doesn't.
Right.
It's the tonality's off because that amp wasn't really designed for headphones. It was designed for speakers in a room. You know, crossovers, whole different system.
That's sort of a fair
So,
point, though,
You got
because
to watch what you mix it with.
we're sort of saying, well, more power is better, which to some extent, yes, but at some point you start to run into other issues where
Right.
intrinsic in the design to make a 1,000-watt amplifier, you run into other compromises.
You need
and
high
issues
gain.
and stuff like that.
You need more gain stages.
You run into
need
noise
more
floor
parts,
problems.
bigger power supplies. Yeah, now the power supply, because you're running 1,000 watts, might be noisier on the quieter passages because
Right.
it's a huge supply it's drawn at. So yeah, basically it's kind of like a bell curve. Let's look at it that way, right? You're at somewhere you want to be up here at the top of the bell curve. You don't want to be too low, you don't want to be too high. And that bell curve is a variable depending on what you're playing.
There's a very large window here. I mean, you could easily drive most headphones with 100 milliwatts, 200, 500
200,
milliwatts,
yeah.
and all the way up to 1, 2, maybe 5, 10 watts. But above like 10 watts, pretty much no headphone really benefits.
Yeah, that you get into highly capable of damaging something.
You don't need
territory.
100 watts or something. There's no point. It doesn't.
Yeah.
You're beyond diminishing returns by such a margin. It's pointless at that point.
Yeah. So yeah, there is definitely an issue when you get too
Well,
big.
it's probably more just the character of the amp at that point that you like,
Right.
Yeah.
not the
Right.
massive overkill headroom. You know.
Yeah. So, and again, we could get into other things like tube amps versus solid state, which is a whole different topic altogether. But
Right.
you know, they have different characteristics when they're put under load and used, and different sonic characteristics. So
Yep.
again, and people who already have gone through both of that understand that and usually they'll pick a side. Some people are solid state kind of people, and some people are tube people. It's the same with speaker amps.
Well, it sort of is similar enough, though, between tube and solid state. You start hitting a point where it starts to become actually somewhat more difficult to make an amplifier with that power level. So to make the price point, the size, the form factor, the efficiency where it needs to be or whatever, maybe they're pushing things harder than they would otherwise. Like you don't see a lot of 1,000-watt Class A amplifiers,
None.
right? It's problematic to design something like that, right?
Yeah.
Not to say it's not theoretically
It's called a
possible.
space heater.
Of course it is. But there starts to become design considerations, thoughts, and whatnot that start to become a limiting factor in higher power. So you start to see this transition as the power starts to really escalate, and it changes how you're going to design the amp. And below like 5 or 10 watts, usually you could pretty much do whatever you want. Heat isn't really a big issue. Cost and size tend to not be an issue in these factors like that. So yeah, you start to run into diminishing returns and cost concerns and size, space, weight.
And that all gets weighed out by the amp manufacturer. Right. You know, they figure it out.
Yeah.
They'll do Class A for the first couple watts, and they'll switch to A/B operation for the higher, more, you know, when it requires more power and all that good stuff. They've been all kinds of novel approaches to amplifier design and how it handles shifting gears when you suddenly call upon it to go beyond it, above and beyond. You know?
Well, yeah, I saw an interesting approach not too long ago. New amp. Here we go. Macintosh again. They have a new like amp out it's a tube amp and a solid state amp all in one. So it's made for solid state for the lows and then tube for the mids and highs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It has separate speaker terminals or what?
Yeah, it's like huge.
So it's it's a bi-amp.
Two amps in one.
No, yeah. That's almost silly. At that point,
Well, that's like when you don't
amps.
have the price isn't really as much of a concern.
Oh right.
You can do stuff like that.
Yeah. It's probably made for some sort of speaker that they're into.
Maybe.
You know, because I could see that with certain designs where you're running a really large woofer on a speaker.
Yeah.
And it wants solid state.
And it's just impractical to get the power
Yeah,
and
the tubes
impedance
can,
with tubes.
the impedance is an issue. The amp
Yeah.
can't control the woofer. It's just too much EMF going on there to deal with. So, but anyway, yeah, it's probably made for certain speakers. And again, you know, that's the thing though. When you get in the upper end of things, you're running 2, 3, 4 bass drivers, right, in parallel or some series parallel config. It's usually demanding. You know, usually you're going to kind of try to like parallel them as much as you can, right? So if you're running 2, 3 woofers and it's a 4 ohm load, you know, and each woofer is like 16 or 14 ohms or some crap, right? You're dropping to 4. You know, you're going to, again, you know, the amplifier is going to need to have some serious power supply and current reserve to be able to drive that speaker through, which tubes would be tough to do. What would happen is you'd wind up with a really low damping factor from the tube stage, and the speaker would go boom, boom for bass instead of boom, boom, tight, right? Because it doesn't have the control. The tube amp has got a few ohms output impedance, trying to drive a 4 ohm load, and it's like, well, half the power is getting lost in the amp, just in current loss. So it doesn't work like that real well for sound.
So that was their compromise.
Yeah, that was their thing. It's like, all right, we're going to make a beefy solid state design just for that. Kind of like subs, right? Subs are the same way. They got Class D switchers in there that are running 1, 2, 3,000 watts.
That's true.
Of power.
Yeah, you don't see tube powered subs.
It's not
just
not
too much
practical.
power.
Right.
It's just not practical.
Right.
Can't
They're
do
way
it.
too
Well, you can't
big
fit
and
in the
expensive.
box, and they're usually all enclosed and everything, so you can't have like tubes inside a box. So.
I remember the older designs from, was it Definitive? Remember Definitive Audio?
They still exist.
Years ago. I think they're still around, yeah. Sandy Gross started that company and sold it a while ago and started another one. Now he sold that. I guess he's out of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I just found out not too long ago that he sold...
Golden Ear?
Yeah, Golden Ear, yeah. I don't know who bought it. Audio Quest? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, their subs ran right off the line. You plug it in the wall, and I don't remember what they were doing, but there was no transformer, which is kind of scary. You know,
It's just like
they ran
rectifies
right off a
AC.
120
Yeah.
rectified. Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
170 volts power supply. So they basically had unlimited rail voltage to deal with the sub, and you know
Well, it's cheaper to
whatever
get
the
away
wall
with
will
it.
give you. Yeah, so.
Yeah, don't open them, though.
Yeah, don't open them. Yeah,
While they're plugged in.
Yeah, really. Yeah, you got a lot of voltage there at all times, you know, and no isolation really. But yeah, that was a cheap and dirty way of making a sub, was just run it right off the line voltage and rectify.
Subs
it.
don't care all that much, so it makes sense.
Yep. But anyway, we really got sidetracked as usual.
Yeah.
And there you go. There's the whole reason why
Well,
bigger can be
some
better.
sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of, kind of, yeah.
Always pretty much technical reasons.
Yeah.
It's just sort of easier, better, or whatever.
And just be careful, because as you get bigger, you get a little more dangerous. You got to have control, self-control.
You can't just hammer the volume on anything.
Yeah. You got to understand the limitations of the driver. That thing could sound pretty good at higher levels. You get some clean sounding headphones, and it'll play through as loud as you get, right to the point where it stops playing. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, that was the limit.
Right.
So anyway, take care, everyone. Hit subscribe. We need more subscribers to make sure that people know we're around. Take care. Thanks.